This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. It is the first of my shows about classical music composers. The first up is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and I have three experts on his life and career, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Mozart is the subject. I have three men who will be discussing his life and career work. They are Nick Till, Martin Nedbel, and Simon Keefe. Let me start with Nick on the left. Let me just ask you a little bit about yourself, your background, and what drew you to the work of Mozart. Any works that you have written about him?
Well, I teach at the University of Sussex, where I'm a professor of opera and music theatre. But I started my career as a opera director, working in most of the main opera companies in Britain and elsewhere. And one of the things that I found when I was working on productions of Mozart operas was that there was, I thought, really very thin and uninspired critical literature at that time, and we're talking now about the early 80s. And so I basically I did the classic thing. I realized that I was going to have to write the book that I was looking for. And I then spent the next 8 years writing a book called Mozart and the Enlightenment, which is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily a study of his opera, because opera was the genre that I was most familiar and most engaged with, in which I tried to locate those works in their historical context, and thereby to show that Mozart was thoroughly engaged in the intellectual and political and social concerns of his day, that he was not some idiot genius. You have to remember that Peter Schaffer's play Amadeus just come out, and this whole image of Mozart as a sort of divine buffoon had become the prevalent view of him, and I wanted to challenge that view by trying to piece together his intellectual relationships, to show how the ideas of the Enlightenment both came to Vienna, and then how Mozart himself was very, very intimately engaged with those ideas, not just sort of in a blanket sense, but with particular groupings within Viennese Enlightenment, and then show how those are revealed in the operas.
Yeah, Amadeus sort of made Mozart out to have a great mind and a great anus, and that was about it. Let me just ask you though, when you say that it was neglected, certainly you mean just his biographical those neglect?
Well, no,
yeah,
the
because
analysis of the operas, really was what I was thinking. I was looking for, I was working with these works and thinking there are ideas in these works that I can't quite get a grasp on, and I can't find any kind of critical reading of these works that really goes beyond what we would call nowadays a sort of liberal humanist reading, just based on psychology and or kind of formal analysis or whatever, rather than an attempt to actually show them as historical documents of their time.
That's interesting. We'll talk about maybe that in a little bit, because given that he's one of the 2 or 3 most well-known composers in history, that you would think there was a dearth is interesting. But let me move on to Martin Nedbel. If you could give a little background about yourself and what may be your specialty in Mozartia is.
Sure. So I'm an assistant professor of musicology at the University of Kansas, and but originally I'm from the Czech Republic, and so Mozart, as maybe we will talk about later, is very important for that small country, and so I sort of have always been exposed to his music and his legacy, and so I was really interested in him when I started my musicology studies. But then, at first, actually, in my career, I focused on his time and importance for Vienna. I think one of the most influential books for me was Nicholas Till's book, Mozart and the Enlightenment, and so I was really interested in Mozart's involvement with his social, cultural, and intellectual context in Vienna in the 1780s.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my greatest interests was in Mozart and morality and didacticism in his works, particularly moments in his operas when characters turn to the audience to deliver some sort of wisdom, such as praising, fidelity, or mercy, and things like that. And again, I wanted to explore them more. These moments are in general connected to this ideal of the Enlightenment era and sort of art as education. And the more I looked into these, I realized that there was more to that, a context that has not been explored before, especially the context of German national culture in Vienna in that time. And so in my book that I recently published, I talk about how these moments in Mozart's operas are connected to these debates about German national culture of the time. A big point that I make is that Germans, or I should say German speakers in Central Europe at that time, felt a little bit inferior because they felt their culture wasn't did not have such a great tradition as the Italian or French opera and theater. And one way they wanted to compensate for that was by stressing morality, and then also pointing out the supposed immorality of the French and the Italians. And so I basically look at Mozart's German operas as tapping into these discussions about German national culture, and then also being influenced by the attempts of the state and imperial authorities in Austria to transform German language theater into an institution that was shaping specific well-behaved subjects of the state. And so another point of the book is that in fact this attempts from the state authorities to control theater also came with lots of financial support. And so contrary to what we nowadays think about states trying to meddle with the arts, in fact many artists, and I think including Mozart, actually welcome this state control, because it came also with a lot of prestige and state support for German language culture.
Well, okay. I just want to say, before I move on to Simon, I just wanted to follow up on your idea of nationalism, because you said you were originally from the Czech Republic, and the Czech Republic used to be part of Czechoslovakia, used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and before that, in Mozart's day, was part of the Holy Roman Empire, which was, as famously known, is not holy, not Roman, nor an empire. But even though we think of Mozart as a German ethnically, is he considered a national hero in the Czech Republic?
That's a really great question, and it's actually the subject of my present study. So my projects now focus on Mozart in Prague, and I think one of the things that's really fascinating about the composer is that he's so important, so famous, that people have been talking about him constantly for the past 2.5 centuries, and so in a way we can use him as as an insight into what people, the ideologies that people subscribe to in different periods of time. And in the Czech Republic, it's really problematic because he is a German composer, yet he was very important for Prague. He was probably the most important thing that happened to Prague in the 18th century, musically or culturally. Then, of course, the problem also was that Prague then was a predominantly German-speaking city. So it just creates a lot of ironies and lots of tensions. And I think presently Mozart is thought of as a German artist, but as someone who is very important for the cultural developments of in what is now the Czech Republic.
Okay, well, let me turn to Simon Keefe and ask you then, Simon, what you have written about Mozart and your, your basic focus in your career on him.
Hello, thanks, Dan. I'm at the University of Sheffield. I'm James Rossiter Hoyle, Chair of Music, and I've been writing about Mozart, I think, one way or another for the last 25 years or so, since I've done my master's degree and PhD at Boston University and Columbia Universities. Started out very much with Mozart's instrumental music. My dissertation of my first book was on Mozart's piano concertos. And most specifically the ways in which we consider the piano and the orchestral participants interact. I do that through talking about dialogue, and I set dialogue in a dramatic context, both in relation to Mozart's operas, of course, but also in relation to theories of spoken drama as well, debating it all in the context of the Age of Enlightenment, so a little bit of overlap there with both Martin's and obviously Nick's work. And from there, I moved on to writing a more general book about instrumental style, his Viennese period, so the last decade, 1781 to 1791, modeling ways in which instrumental genres developed Mozart over the 10-year period, and I fixed on an idea which I called reinvention, which was about how certain stylistic qualities would reach climactic points, and then Mozart would reinvent his attitude towards that genre based on having reached a particular finite point relative to whatever that may be in a particular genre. After that, I moved on to a third monograph, which is on Mozart's Requiem, where I talk about issues of reception, style, particularly also performance, and thorny issues over the completion of the Requiem, which of course is an age-old issue that's been discussed ever since it was first completed by his sort of associate Francis Meyer in early 1792. And in a way that sort of represents a lot of my work sort of with intersections of issues of biography and aesthetics and style and performance and perception. And in a sense, they came together quite a bit in the context of the Requiem book, and they've also come together. My last book, which is due to be published actually in about a week's time with Cambridge, which is a biography of Mozart in Vienna, Mozart in Vienna, the final decade, where I deal with issues of, particularly of how Mozart as a performer and a composer, how that balance operates in the context of dealing with performers, singers in operas, whether they're people he knows, instrumentalists he knows, or of course general musical public he's writing for when he's writing for publication. And so I set out, tried to deal with all of those, tried to juggle all of those various different situations that he has to deal with in the context of his Viennese from 1781 to 1791. As I say, that was my project that I finished about 6 months or so ago.
Well, I'll link to all three of your web pages, but feel free to, in a week or so when the book comes online, to send me a link and I'll add it to it, Simon, for your latest book. But before we get to the man and the music, just as I did yesterday in talking about Wittgenstein, someone who is so well known inevitably has myths that crop up about them. I want to just talk about some of them, both related to directly to the music and also the sort of what we call sort of modern gossip there. And I'll certainly touch upon the Amadeus play and film from Peter Schaefer, as that seems to have been one of the major exponents of a lot of, I guess people would say, misinformation. But let me just talk about the music and its relationship to what came before and then what came after. I know that from just reading up on it, that Mozart, one of the criticisms that was made famous in the movies was that he uses too many notes, that there was a complexity that he brought to music that before, if you listen to something like Handel's Messiah or earlier works, was not there. Is this true, do you think, in the main? And is that one of the major things that is Mozart sort of a prism through which everything changed afterward, or a bottleneck? Let me start with you, Nick. So,
well, I think well, certainly there is evidence that in his own day, quite a lot of his contemporaries found his music to be too complex and challenging and demanding, and that's very much in the context of a musical culture that is still very much based upon leisure and entertainment, that is only starting to think of music as something that has intellectual substance, that particularly instrumental music, music that isn't attached to song or words or drama or whatever, can in fact be, and increasingly came to be seen as, the most sort of the purest and highest form of music. But Mozart's writing just on the sort of edge of that moment. I mean, Haydn, who was older than him, was also developing a musical forms and genres where there is this notion of listening to music as an intellectual activity. So I mean, that's part of that. The response. I mean, we have to remember that no one wrote more complex music than Bach. So it's not as if Mozart is in some way, marks some milestone in the development of the history of music. And indeed, the discovery of Bach for Mozart, who was Bach by the time Mozart was starting his career, was deemed to be a fusty old, pedantic old composer, and Mozart was introduced to Bach in Vienna, to Bach's music, and there's certainly evidence in his music. I think that he absorbed some of kinds of contrapuntal modes of writing that he learned from Bach, and that also gave his music a kind of additional sense of seriousness and complexity. And there were increasingly his contemporaries who appreciated that and saw that as part of this new culture of music, and as increasingly seen as the highest art form, because it's the most abstract, the most spiritual art form. And then other contemporaries who were hoping for something that was more, like diversion and entertainment, and didn't want to be challenged in quite the same way.
Martin, any comment?
So, personally, I just found Mozart's music extremely fascinating. It's one of those types of music that you can listen to over and over, and you constantly find new things. And also from the perspective of so I have studied his operas and compared them to operas of his contemporaries, and I have to say that from the comparison, there is definitely a difference. That he just there's definitely just much more stuff to listen to and to find in his music. Sometimes I explain it to my students as it's as if he just couldn't stop himself to put so much stuff into his music that sometimes it does become a little bit overwhelming in the amount of complexity of ideas, not necessarily of sort of harmonic or contrapuntal complexity like Bach, or other kinds of complexities that develop in later music, but just in the amount of different viewpoints and ideas that are played with in a single piece of music.
How about you, Simon? What are your comments about Mozart? Was he sort of a bottleneck that everything led up to him and everything flows from him afterwards?
Well, I mean, let me reflect first of all, I think, Dan, on the issue of too many notes, which you brought up, which is, I mean, it's quite interesting that comment allegedly was made by Emperor Joseph II to Mozart in the context of his first opera in Vienna, Führung, which I know Martin has written about, and obviously Nick in the context of his book as well. And actually, when you listen to Führung, there are a lot of notes. By that, I don't mean anything critical, but I mean there is a sense of kind of overt virtuosity that you get. Contemporary critics talked about this as well, that you don't get in the later operas. And Führung is, in certain ways, very different stylistically from Figaro, from Don Giovanni, from Fantutti, and also from Magic 2. I think of all of the roulades you get at the end of numbers, at the end of the great arias, at the end of other numbers as well. So there is a sense that Mozart was trying. I think the thing about Führung for me is that it was absolutely vital in 1782. Mozart had an operatic success. Yes, and he had one. You know, it was incredibly successful both in Vienna and then arguably his most successful work while he was alive in the remaining 9 years of his life. So I think that there is something in there in relative to this remark, apocryphal or not, that Joseph II made. I mean, obviously Amadeus, incidentally, I'm a big fan. You've been slightly negative about Amadeus, which is fine, I understand, but I'm a big fan of Amadeus because actually, in some respects, I don't think it matters whether it's factually correct or not. I think it's the persuasiveness or not, the interpretation, I think that's much more interesting. And I think actually Amadeus looks better with all the years that passed than probably it did in the mid 1980s when it came out. Perhaps say something else relative to what was raised about Mozart in context, as it were, from before or after. I mean, one thing, and this relates to what Martin's pointing out about just the and Nick too, about there being lots of complexity, lots of things going on. There was a lexicographer who wrote 2 editions of his dictionary. Ernst Ludwig Gerth was his name, lived in central Germany, wrote one in 1790 to 1792, and then wrote a second one, a kind of revised, huge expansion in 1810 to 1812, I think, are the dates, or maybe 1812, 1814, certainly around about that time, 20 years later. And I remember that he says in his first article on Mozart, 1790, I think it is, that Mozart he didn't quite understand Mozart compositionally. He was obviously the best performer in Europe in the piano. Everybody acknowledged that. Gerber did too. But he said that something about his compositions that in certain respects wasn't completely easy to understand, and that resonates with what both Martin and Nick have said. 20 years later, he then says Mozart, he analysed his own analysis really, and says Mozart was a meteor that arrived too early on the scene and departed too early as well. In other words, we didn't have the full capacity to understand the full impact of what he meant to us up to 1790, and then of course died in 1791. And the first 2 decades outside of his posthumous, I was going to say posthumous life, but his posthumous reception were extraordinary in terms of how he grew within a year or 2 of his death to be, acknowledged as one of the greatest composers of all time. So, there is a sense, it is absolutely right. Again, I think something Martin said about listening and listening again and paying attention to listening the whole time. Now, that was quickly picked up on by critics posthumously as well. And the first sort of musical biography that we get from Mozart is from a chap called Ignaz Arnold, again, who writes basically about how we have to study the scores, and we have to listen again and again, and Mozart's music pays dividends as a result of doing that. And that wasn't an activity that one took for granted in the late 18th or the very early part of the 19th century. That studying a score was something that one should do. And for example, string quartets, let's take just that as one genre, one example, until around about the very early years of the 19th century, they would appear only in parts, get string quartet scores. But then various publishers wised up and thought, oh, actually, let's produce scores, then you can see the whole thing as it the issue of studying and re-listening and re-looking at a piece of work then takes hold, so can benefit from that.
Well, let me follow up with you and then work my way back across the strip here, Simon. In both the play and the film of Amadeus, there are two major, I guess, myths that people came away with it. The first was that, you know, that Salieri was somehow this dark figure that was envious and shadowing Mozart and possibly killed him, and that was rather easily dismissed as just a dramatic invention. But the more, I guess, persistent myth about Mozart that was he was some sort of what would be called an idiot savant or an autistic person. You know, he started as a child prodigy, but unlike 99% of child prodigies, he actually ended up producing something. Most child prodigies, by the time they're 20, they haven't advanced. They're just advanced for it as a child. What do you think was the internal state of Mozart that allowed him to go beyond most child prodigies? Did he have these, I guess we would call them modernly now, autistic tendencies, that he was just so super focused on things, or what?
I mean, I think it's a good question. Clearly, he did have that incredible focus on musical activity, and you get letters. Of course, the letters are wonderful. 1,000 pages or so in English translation tell us so much about Mozart and guide us so much relevant to what we write and how we think about Mozart. So he does write to his father about how, you know, from Paris, I think in 78, you know, I'm absorbed in music. I'm thinking about music the whole time. Wrote that about a month, three or 4 weeks after his mother died. He's already then sort of reabsorbed in music totally, and happy to tell that to his father, who's back in Salzburg, who has experienced the horrific loss of his wife, Leopold Mozart. Mozart's wife, rather, Leopold, dying when it's on Mozart's watch and he's miles and miles away. So there is that sense. So as I say, 3 weeks later, Mozart can still talk about how absorbed he is in music. So there is that, you know, absolute kind of sort of obsessive quality to his personality. I'm sure that has some bearing on what he how. The interesting question of how he makes that transition. I mean, I think the best way of thinking about that is to say that the confluence of various factors in Mozart's youth, I think, relative to who he was and his family background and what he was able to absorb, it was an absolute perfect kind of come together of such that was right for him at that time. So obviously he has a father, Leopold Mozart, who in his own right wrote the leading violin treatise on playing the violin in the 18th century. He would be a well-known figure, century figure in his own right, irrespective of his parentage of Mozart. And Leopold then felt, you know, obligation to take this child, this miracle who was born in Salzburg, as Leopold calls him, around Europe to show him off. You know, this is God's work, as it were. Let's admire him. And Mozart, I think, you couldn't have given him a better kind of start in life than a kind of cosmopolitan absorption of so much of what was going on musically around Europe, Germany, southern Germany, in Mannheim, kind of to the west. Obviously over to Paris. He was in London for 18 months. Yeah, he's witnessing pretty much everything that's going on, and he's in Vienna as well for a couple of short visits. There is that sense in which this sponge-like quality, he has to absorb everything. Again, he writes to his father at one stage, Father, I've got the ability to imitate any style of composition whenever I want. It's not just imitate, it's absorb and then cultivate it in such a way that it becomes his own, as it were. And I think that you know, there are trips, so many trips between 1763, when he's just 7, and 1772, when he's about 16 or so, trips to Northern Europe, 3 trips to Italy, trips to Vienna, trips to Munich, etc. There's some sense in which he's just getting the world of music presented on a plate in front of him in a way, of course, that you might take for granted, that kind of dissemination now based on our modern technologies and our modern forms of communication, etc. But obviously in the late 18th century, things are totally and completely different. Mozart stood to benefit in extraordinary ways from it. I think that facilitates his ability to be writing, such wonderful works, even in the early 1770s, when, as I say, he's barely 16, 17, 18.
Martin, let me ask your opinion about what made Mozart be able to go from a child prodigy, of which there have been many over the, hundreds or thousands over the centuries, to actually become an accomplished titan that's still remembered, whereas many of these other prodigies have faded away. Do you think there was something in him innately, or was it his parenting, or what?
Well, I mean, he was definitely a prodigy. So he was able to play multiple instruments when he was a child. He was composing musical compositions at a very early age. He was recognized as a prodigy, and I think thanks to his father, just was traveling around Europe and then absorbing all these styles, as we just heard. But I think that there are definitely this idea of him as an eternal child, and sort of a somehow immature, maybe also has to do with the fact that he died at such a young age, and so sometimes we compare him to these other masters and geniuses of Western music who lived much longer, and so then naturally we then focus on the periods of his life when he was much younger, and then we study his letters and statements from a much younger period, and I think that then contributes to this sense that somehow he was immature, and but I think a big problem is that he just didn't have the time to sort of develop into what we would call sort of a mature period, and I think that's where then a lot of these questions come from, as to how could he do that if he was so young, and was he did he how could he have done that, and things like that. But even though there definitely are proofs that he was very self-disciplined, and he was serious, and he was in this freak of nature. He was able to deal with lots of different people on the social level, and so I think it was just a combination of his innate abilities, but also his ability to be very versatile in dealing with his contemporaries that allowed him to get as far as he did.
Nick, what is your comment on what separated Mozart from other prodigies that we probably barely know?
Well, I think I would add to what's been said. It sort of goes back to one of my core points. I think not only was he musically omnivorous and had this extraordinary facility to absorb and then transform all these different musical languages and styles, but actually he was also quite clearly intellectually engaged, and I think that is what makes the difference between someone who just has a facility in say composition or performance or whatever, and someone who then links what he hears, the musical languages and styles and things that he finds, to intellectual preoccupations. And I mean, one can give a couple of examples. We've heard mention of Mozart having spent time in Paris with his mother. He was packed off to Paris to see if that would be a good place for him to make his career, because it had a more a sort of more stimulating public concert life than quite a lot of German cities. But what's astonishing is that when he was in Paris, he was introduced, and there's a letter from his father saying, when you get to Paris, I'll make sure that you meet all of Leopold Ben Liszt, or of the great Enlightenment philosophers of the time. So he says, D'Alembert and Diderot and so on, we all have introductions to them. And then when Mozart is there, he's staying in the house of a woman called Madame d'Épinay, who was a very important figure in French Enlightenment circles. She held a salon, which was a very important kind of focus for intellectual discussion. She was a writer. She was the partner of a very important German in Paris, who was one of the propagators of the Enlightenment in Germany. And she and this German guy called Baron Grimm had also been closely associated with Rousseau. So Mozart was staying, and with Diderot. So Mozart was staying right in the heart of French intellectual enlightenment. So he's picking up these debates that are going on. We can see that because these enlightenment philosophers were also fascinated by opera. They had all sorts of ideological arguments about how opera should develop and so on. And you can see that Mozart had responded to these ideas, and that when he came to write, to be commissioned to write Idomeneo, which is technically an Italian opera, he had absorbed the ideas of French opera. The Idomeneo is much more of a French opera than an Italian opera, even though it's sung in Italian. And he took those ideas to create a kind of new form. It's a sort of somewhere between Gluck reformed opera and French tragedy lyrique and Italian opera to kind of create this new form. But he understands what the sort of aesthetic and intellectual principles are. And then later, when he's looking around for an idea for a comic opera that he's being commissioned to write in Vienna for 1786, he tells us, first of all, that he has read hundreds of libretti to try and find a subject. So we know that, he didn't just sort of take what was thrown at him by somebody. He really hunted around to find the right one. And then what does he come up with? He comes up with the most controversial play of only a couple of years old that are presented in Paris, which embodies a great many of the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers in dramatic form. The Marriage of Figaro by Beaumarchais, and he says, that's what I want for my opera. So you can see how, all the way through, like many more examples, you can see how engaged he is, and I think that's the difference, that this astonishing musical facility and everything is combined with an extraordinary intellectual and cultural engagement.
Well,
can I just come in there, Dan?
Go ahead.
Don't disagree with anything, of course, that Nick has said, but although I'd just like to take up one particular point. I mean, it's absolutely right that in many instances Mozart did have a say in the libretto. Allegedly, Lorenzo da Ponte, the librettist of Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni and Cosi, said that Mozart had chosen Figaro. It was Mozart's choice. At other times, it clearly was the case that Mozart didn't have much say in the libretto that he set. Dien Führung, for example, was not a choice of his. He was just very eager to get a commission in 1782. Clemenza di Tito, which was opera he completed in next to no time, probably just a handful of weeks in the summer of his last year, 1791. Again, he had no say in that choice of text. Probably Don Giovanni as well. We're not entirely sure. So there is. I think just we have to be a little bit careful relative to knowing what represents contribution intellectually. And as I say, I completely agree that aspect of intellectual engagement is clearly there with Mozart. But we have to be a little bit careful about what we attribute to Mozart, as it were, and what we attribute to producers, directors, what we attribute to librettists, etc., and theatrical conventions, etc.
Well, I want to move on to the actual historical side, but before I do, I want to pick up on the opera thing because I'm not a classical music aficionado by any means. So my next question may seem too simplistic, but you can let me know if it is. And that is, I mentioned Salieri and his use as an antagonist to Mozart and Amadeus. But in real life, for example, if you were to Google greatest composers, even though people could make arguments for Bach or Vivaldi or other people, and I've seen that, probably 90% online of arguments are between Mozart and Beethoven. And one of the major differences that's always posited is that Mozart's music is divine, Beethoven's was more human. And I'm wondering if part of that is because of operas. As far as I know, Beethoven only wrote one opera, whereas Mozart wrote many. And as far as I know, again, I'm not an opera expert by any means, but in their day, opera was seen as a tool of didacticism, of morality. And I'm wondering if this idea of Mozart as being the divine and Beethoven being the sort of rock star, the grunge rock star of classical music, has something to do with the fact that Mozart wrote many operas and Beethoven did not. So let me start with you, Nick. Do you think that the form of the opera itself maybe lent to this idea of Mozart being divine, whereas Beethoven was more grounded in the real?
Well, I think, the idea of Mozart being divine is a part of the sort of posthumous mythologization of Mozart, because I think actually most people would say that what makes his operas remarkable is precisely that he is so intensely human. I mean, is able to convey such an enormous range of human emotions and affect, and indeed, to some extent, probably it is those composers for whom opera is a primary vehicle, and I think that probably is the case. For Mozart, he didn't always have the opportunities to write opera, but it's something he returned to all the time. It was a constant theme throughout his life of the need to write opera. So I think those composers are precisely the ones who we might say have an understanding of human nature. I suspect Beethoven, it's Beethoven's opera Fidelio that is terribly high-minded and idealistic and very, very noble and inspiring. But you might say, in terms of sort of complexity of psychology or characterization, certainly doesn't quite have the same means as Mozart.
Well, let me just ask you then, Nick, do you think rather than divine and human that Mozart, because when I listen to Mozart, in my mind I get this sense of sort of like the Big Bang, things exploding outward, whereas with Beethoven, you get the sense of sort of like King Lear wandering on a dark, eternal heath and whatnot. Do you think that a more proper way to describe the music is Mozart is externally based, whereas Beethoven is internally based?
Well, it's yes. I mean, that's not a bad sort of a possible way of characterizing them, although. Again, Beethoven as King Lear, as it were, is another part of a mythologization that has taken place of Beethoven. And there's a very interesting piece article by Nicholas Cook, where he shows how certain characters of Beethoven's music, certain pieces, have led to this profile of him. I mean, this concept of Beethoven as a hero, the heroic figure of Beethoven, and it's very selective the way in which that image has been picked up. But I might term what you just said in terms of inner and outer. It may well be that again, because Mozart is working in opera, which he's a lot of the time he projects these, what we might call innerness, the idea of innerness, onto his characters. Actually, there's a way of sort of externalizing. But of course, as a lot of his music is very, full of what Germans would call innerlich, innerness. But there's an interesting thing one could say, which I do think is there's one music psychology critic who's used the distinction between exogamous and endogamous external music that sort of reflects human behavior and life externally, and music which conveys the feelings of emotions and actions and things. And I actually would say that that distinction works very well, perhaps for, say, Mozart on the one hand against Haydn. Haydn for me is very much a composer who models gestures and sort of social ideas externally, and whose music is often actually, in a sense, more intellectual than Mozart's, because you can follow lines of sort of logic and clarity being followed through in a quite sort of external way, whereas Mozart's music always feels to me to be embodied. It feels to sort of be grounded in a sort of sense of being human in the world from inside. So that for me is one of the sort of attributes of his music.
Martin, since you're a bit younger, you maybe appreciate the dichotomy that I'm going to use. Do you think that Mozart and Beethoven to classical music are sort of what superhero comic fans would call the Superman and Batman of classical music, or is that just sort of a myth too?
Even us older ones have heard of Superman and Batman.
Okay, but I figured I figure he's closer to having read those comics, though. But
right.
Anyway.
Well, I think that in some ways Mozart is actually sort of he's fortunate, if we can use that term, to have lived at the time when he lived, so the late 18th century, which was in a way a time when how music was perceived was changing, and musicians in general, because up to that time musicians and composers were and I'm generalizing, but were sort of servants, right? They were either in service of the church or of the court and the aristocracy. But in the late 18th century, with the Enlightenment, we start having these democratic movements and individualism and capitalism. And so artists are switching into this position of sort of free agents. And so then it's sort of that development really comes to a big change with Beethoven, who then becomes who already during his lifetime is seen as this great master who through his artworks is shining or is creating this unique vision of his individuality, and that in sense then reflects back on Mozart later. And so that's and it's I think it's only therefore in the 19th century and during the Romantic era that people start and critics and audiences start viewing music as something divine and special, whereas in the 18th century there was still this idea that music was needed to have some sort of specific social function. So it was supposed to be used in the church or in the theater or to celebrate the aristocracy or the monarchy or the empire and so on. And so in some ways I think when Mozart is definitely the human composer in that he's able to reflect all these social aspects of his time, and then Beethoven in his music is trying to, or is perceived as showing a particular unique vision of his interiority. I really sometimes like to use the theories of a literary historian, Daniel Abrams, who who conceives of this difference as mirror and the lamb, right? And he says that he talks about literature, but he says that in the 18th century, artworks are sort of like a mirror of the outside world, whereas in the 19th century, in Romanticism, artworks are supposed to emit this unique vision of the master artist, and so in a way, in some ways, Mozart and Beethoven are a little bit belong to these two distinct groups, even though starting in the 19th century, then all of art, the historical art of that artist is then being appreciated through this new paradigm of sort of this divine expression. And so then I think even nowadays, the way we understand Mozart is sort of influenced by how he has been understood in the later periods and the later decades of the 19th century. Even although his contemporaries probably approached his music differently.
Simon, let me just ask you about Beethoven and Mozart. Do you think that their respective mythic characters alone have made them dominate the debate about the greatness in classical music? I mean, certainly Bach fans exist and other people, but these two seem to have been almost the yin and yang of classical music.
Yeah, they certainly have a reputation that probably for the general music public goes beyond anybody else. I think Martin's absolutely right that in a sense Beethoven and Mozart have to be looked at entirely differently. And just to add a bit to what he's saying, really in Mozart, well, in Beethoven's time, so we're dealing with him writing his finest works, obviously in the first 2.5 decades of the 19th century. Mozart obviously writing up to 1791 and his death. That basically Vienna was set up from the kind of mid-1790s onwards, really to promote the kind of the compositional genius, as it were, in the modern sense of the term to some extent. There were annuities that were provided for Beethoven to work from the big at the time. He didn't have a lot to worry about in monetary terms, at least. Certainly not in the way that Mozart did. And I think that for Mozart, again, as Martin was saying, there's much more of a mentality that musicians are there to serve rather than to create some sort of totemic works of art. But that, for me, actually, that accepting that there is that big difference in culture, which I really do think does exist. I think there is a sense that in a way, the opera parallel is unfair to Beethoven, at least, in that obviously he did only write the one opera, Fidelio, which he revised endlessly and clearly caused him a lot of trouble, and Nick is saying isn't the most satisfying of Beethoven's works in various respects. Mozart obviously wrote a lot of opera, so it's not a fair fight between the two. Where the fight is fair, as it were, is in instrumental music. And let's take the concertos, for example, where I always think, I would say this, wouldn't I give my Mozart scholar, but there is a kind of spontaneity, there's a level of immediacy, there's a flexibility of kind of emotional content, expressive content, perhaps is a better way to put it, that Mozart plays with as an extraordinarily gifted player as well as composer. That spontaneity, that ebb and flow, don't get that really in the same way in Beethoven's concertos, when he really is self-consciously chiseling this great work of art, as it were, that meets, in a sense, Beethoven is always heading towards what he perceives to be the kind of final, to quote, version of a text which he doesn't want to be altered. Whereas we know for certain that it was never Mozart's aspiration to develop a text that was final and finalized in any kind of meaningful sense of the term. Mozart was much more into performing for the here and now, and he had absolutely no problem making modifications to works after performances, particularly dynamic markings, articulation markings, etc. So, and he would continue to do that after publication, whereas Beethoven, there was much more of a kind of a sort of linear move from performing a concerto to publishing it, and interactions with publishers and making sure everything is exactly right, etc., with the idea of getting to sort of definitive final state, which of course is what caused Beethoven trouble at various stages. That's why he kept revising various works, because he kept thinking he could get them to a better state than they were in. So I think if you take the concertos as one example, as I say, of where Mozart and Beethoven can be, in some senses, compared, notwithstanding the musico-cultural differences that we know that they experience. I think their kind of level of spontaneity, ingenuity, etc. Mozart wins the day.
Yeah, I know it's the part of the mythos is that things came easier to Mozart, but Beethoven tried harder, kind of thing. But let's move away from myth and we.
Can I? Yes, I think Mozart did try. Yes, I think absolutely. There's a letter where Mozart says, somebody said to Mozart, a musician said to Mozart, you make it sound so easy. How does it come so easily to you? It's improvisation. And he says something like, well, I had to work really hard in order to make it seem so easy.
Yeah.
And that. So actually, there is that sense again. What we were saying earlier about kind of absorption, about immersing himself in music. There is a sense in which that all that hard work has been done. And of course, I would grant you that Beethoven is extraordinarily hard worker in terms of sketching, in terms of revisions, etc., etc. But I think Mozart. I don't think we can make a distinction between Mozart and Beethoven in that respect, because, as I say, I think Mozart is working just as hard. He's working just hard in a different way, as I say, in a different kind of musico-cultural context.
Yeah, I think it might have been the painter Goya or Picasso who was asked something like, how can you paint a masterpiece in just 3 hours? And he said, well, it took me X amount of decades to be able to paint a masterpiece in 3 hours. But let's move on to the real life here. And we talked pretty much about the childhood and the prodigy. So let's move sort of towards the teen years. When did Mozart get recognized as, oh, this guy just isn't a prodigy, this guy is serious? Were there other composers? Was there, like I was talking about Wittgenstein, there was this Vienna Circle of Philosophers. Was there a certain culture of composers that when Mozart did this work that they said, this boy, he's got it, kind of thing? Nick, let me start with you.
Well, the whole question of the reception of Mozart, what in musicological sort of terms we call reception history, is quite spotty in his own day. I mean, we don't. There's not any yet any sort of substantial tradition of music criticism and music reviews. There are. There are people writing music theory or this music in our time and things, but it's pretty. It's sometimes rather random how what the evidence we have for the response to his works. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that there was already emerging in Germany and in northern Germany in particular, this idea of the sort of rather high mission of music, music as an elevated art, and quite often it is amongst those circles that Mozart starts to get picked up. Goethe picked up on Mozart, and Goethe, to some extent, is part of that same culture. But Goethe, we've heard about Entführung and the success it had. Goethe was one of the people who was sort of blown over by Entführung, and actually he's also then recognized and said, actually, this really knocks into the shade all of our efforts to create a German opera, because Mozart's just sort of, we thought a German opera had to have a certain kind of, simplicity and directness, and Mozart's just kind of blown that up and made our efforts look trivial. So you do start to get these kinds of critical responses, and then of course you start to get the ways you start to get the mythology being started to be built up. So the way in which a work like Don Giovanni, not in Mozart's own life, but very quickly Don Giovanni, which is the most obviously sort of dramatic of Mozart's operas, even though it's notionally a comic opera, it gets sort of picked up as being the exemplary proto-romantic work very quickly after Mozart's death. But so you get these strands coming out, but it's very difficult. I mean, to be honest, it's a while since I've looked at all that sort of the reception of Mozart or the scholarship on that. The others may have some more up-to-date thoughts on this, but in my recollection, it's quite slow to pick up.
Martin, the filmmaker Woody Allen once said that the difference between comedy and drama is that drama is sitting at the grown-ups table. Is there a work of Mozart that acted as his invitation to the grown-ups table of composers rather than just being this freakish little kid?
Well, it's again, it's hard to tell because I think this relates to the questions of when exactly does he change from just a prodigy into something more and lasting, and it's hard to it's really hard to compare him to his contemporaries who then became world famous venerated composers again because they just had a lot longer career, and so that's it's just hard to see whether he was already becoming a well accepted master, or whether he was still just during his life, very short life, only seen as this exotic sort of a prodigy. At the same time, there's definitely music that's nowadays considered as a sort of turning point in his career, and actually most I think biographers are pointing to the time around his move to Vienna as sort of the beginning of his mature period, and from the point of view of his operas, it's usually his Idomeneo that's viewed as the first mature work. He wrote it before he moved to Vienna. He wrote it for Munich, but it's seen as a work that's supposedly or presumably different from the earlier works, more complex, more three-dimensional. Again, though, it's hard to tell whether that has to do with the actual intrinsic qualities of the works or with the reception that people just are sort of seeing this work as on the way the Viennese works, and therefore as extremely different.
How about you, Simon? What are your thoughts about the pivotal works that made Mozart Mozart?
Well, I would agree with Martin that Idomeneo is clearly of considerable significance, and he wrote Idomeneo then in 1780 to 81. It premiered, I think, in the end of January 1781. He moved to Vienna he was called by some people to Vienna from Munich, and ended up staying in Vienna subsequently. I mean, he could have been called elsewhere. Mozart's move to Vienna he wanted to get out of the situation in Salzburg, but it was luck, as it were, that took him to Vienna at that particular moment. And, supposedly a number of people had experienced Idomeneo. Baron von Swieten is a case in point, and who I think Nick mentioned. No, we didn't mention earlier. I mentioned Baron Grimm from Paris. Is a different figure altogether. But Baron von Swieten was a Viennese aristocrat and administrator who took Mozart under his wing in the early part of the 1780s. Had these soirees when they talked about Bach and play Bach and Hans, etc. Maybe we did allude to that earlier, in fact. But so I think Idomeneo is significant. But I think when he gets to Vienna, this is his great aspiration is to be taken as seriously as a composer as he is taken as a performer, and by implication, as a prodigy, as it were, prodigious in the performing sense. I mean, there is a sense in which that image of Mozart as child, I think Martin mentioned Mozart as kind of eternal child, as a kind of trope in reception. There is a sense that keeps chasing him around. So he goes to Paris in 1778, having been there in the early to mid 1760s, and he kind of he says that people are remembering him from 15 years or 14, 15 years earlier, and that they're expecting him to be the same kind of figure, which of course he's not by the late 1760s. So there is that aspect that keeps chasing around. But when he gets to Vienna, I think he wrote about Führer, for example, that he wrote to his father, "If it's success, I'm going to be as famous and as well known in Vienna as a composer as I am as a performer." And Führer was a roaring success, both in Vienna in 1782 and then across Europe, premiered all over Europe in the subsequent 9 years. So then I think one of the key moments relative to what you're talking about, or perhaps just moving a little bit beyond what you're talking about, but seeing Mozart as perhaps prodigious in a performance sense, not just prodigious as being a child prodigy. An absolutely key moment is between 1782 and 1786. He writes this whole stream of, remember how many, but 16, 17 piano concertos from the earliest Performer 315 to the last one of that sequence, which is the great C minor 491 and the great C major 503, and they're in 1786. So he has this 4-year stream of concertos where he's the darling of the Viennese audience, and he's not just at one point is he's not just the darling of the Viennese audience as a player, he's the darling of the Viennese audience as a performer composer. So people are subscribing to his concerts, people are going to his public concerts at the Burghaus, the National Theatre in Vienna, paying good money to see him, irrespective of whether it's a private concert or a public one, paying good money, as I say, and they're appreciating him at the centre of the action as both a performer and as a composer. So this idea, I think it's this issue of him making this kind of transition, which you were mentioning earlier, from prodigy, as it were, to established composer, is certainly happening by the time of Domino, and absolutely in the context of the last decade of his life in Vienna. And Nick's right. The reception is spotty in terms of criticism, etc. But there is enough to see that so many of his works are appreciated in his lifetime. Not only the operas, but the wonderful quartet dedicated to Haydn in 1785 as well. The piano concertos, as I say, although there isn't an enormous amount of evidence, reception-related evidence there. The symphonies, certainly the Prague Symphony, certainly the Linz Symphony and the Hafner. Again, these are being appreciated compositionally, and it's not about Mozart the performer in that kind of context. So and then, as we're saying, in terms of the subsequent reception after Mozart dies, then obviously, fairly soon you run out of people to talk about Mozart as a performer. They themselves die in the course of the early part of the 19th century. So this balance between Mozart as performer and Mozart composer begins to weigh very heavily in favour of Mozart the composer in the early part of the 19th century. But what I think we need to preserve is that sense Mozart, what was most important was that balance between the two. And as I say, I'm interpreting a little bit generally your idea of prodigy, because I'm saying he's prodigious in a kind of performing context. He's also obviously a prodigious composer in his youth as well. But I still think that that balance is a particularly important one when it comes to thinking about Mozart's sort of life journey, as it were, put it grandly, and then his journey posthumously as well.
Let me address Martin for this question, since I picked up on this earlier. And in the film Amadeus, we get the sense that Mozart was a victim, if you will, of the patronage system, that he felt confined by it, that he couldn't do what he wanted. I was just reading earlier before the show about how Beethoven found a patron, and the patron eventually, I think it was a duke or something, eventually said, let Beethoven be Beethoven. Mozart didn't seem to have that. And was part of that, do you think, because was he apolitical? Did he, if he could go off and write, he would have gone off and done his stuff. Martin, what do you think of the patronage system and how it affected Mozart politically, and if at all, and creatively?
I have a feeling that the patronage system was just a standard thing that musicians and composers were used to in the 18th century and were able to work with, as was Mozart, because from his letters and what we know about his life, he was pretty successful in dealing with people. Unlike later Beethoven, who was famously not very good with people, and and then I think what the movie shows is a sort of a very romantic 19th century point of view depiction of Mozart, where because of what happens in the 19th century and how because of Beethoven and how we have this image of romantic artists who struggle and who have to fight with social conventions and so on. Again, I think the movie sort of imposes that on Mozart and sort of shows him as restrained by the emperor and by the aristocrats and as fighting against the dictates of what he has to write and how he has to write. But I don't have a feeling that was necessarily the case in the 18th century. That's just again a point of view that became prominent in the 19th century, and that still somehow resonates with us nowadays. So when we think of artists, we like to imagine them as these struggling geniuses who constantly get into conflict and are always not only on the forefront of artistic ideas, but also of social and political ideas. And so then we think of Mozart as a proto-revolutionary and sort of preparing the ideals of French revolutions in some of his works, even though again, I don't think that was necessarily the case. It's something that was read into his biography only later.
How about you,
I would say, if I may come in there, I mean, to some extent, the mythology, there is some truth to the mythologizing of, I'll come back to that in relation to the film. But actually, in some respect, it was much more, I think the situation was more mundane. I think, there's no doubt that Mozart felt restricted and to some extent humiliated by his role as a servant, effectively, to the Archbishop of Salzburg. He had, and this is something quite important to remember, his father Leopold had really inculcated into him this idea that he had some kind of divine gift. Leopold keeps coming back to this. So Mozart does have in relation to his social status, does have is kind of imbued with an inflated sense of his own, how he should be treated in the world. I mean, not inflated from our perspective, because we think it's quite right that a great artist should be treated like that, but or should be treated properly. But in terms of the social status of the time, and we have to remember that Haydn spent the majority of his life working as a liveried court musician, and he also chafed at the bit and took the opportunity to fly off to London when it was offered to him. And when Mozart comes to Vienna, and it's when he's in Vienna particularly that he's most frustrated with his role, because he suddenly sees this actually burgeoning new society, because the Emperor Joseph had only recently, just the year before, become ruler. He had introduced all sorts of liberalizing reforms, and Vienna had become extremely lively, both economically and intellectually and culturally, center. Mozart sees all these amazing opportunities that he could be going off to all of these salons where music making was taking place and so on. And he gets more and more frustrated by the fact that he's basically stuck in the entourage of the Archbishop. And we've got all of this because he writes all of this to his father. And then the film does take that moment. There's a very nice moment in the film, I think, when after Mozart had a success with one of his pieces. The Archbishop has summoned him to perform one of his pieces, and we hear it obviously as a work of genius. And then Salieri talks over a voiceover while it's being played and tells us why it's such a miraculous work. And then there's a rather good moment when Mozart, there's an audience outside who are, as it were, the popular audience, and then inside is the stuffy court audience. Mozart, the doors are flung open, and the audience outside are applauding, and that's a sort of notion of Mozart's genius will be recognised beyond the immediate circumstances that he finds himself in, posterity and the people and so on. And then Mozart turns and he bows to the audience outside, and he lifts his coattails to show his arse to the Archbishop. Now, that's not historical. What is historical is that he quite deliberately provoked his dismissal from the Archbishop essentially by insolence. And as he recounts it, he was kicked down the stairs by the Archbishop's steward, who was so furious with him. So there is a kind of symbolic gesture in the way that Mozart makes his liberation from and then becomes really one of the first, not the first, because Handel was a successful entrepreneurial composer also, but really becomes one of the first entrepreneurial composers in a working as a music production business, as it were. And one of the things you have to remember is actually, quite frankly, the logistics of what he was achieving in, say, all of those piano concerto concerts he was doing. What did it take to communicate with every musician in Vienna who he would need to get to come along to play in a concert? What would it take for him to have to write all of those letters to ask the people for subscriptions to the concert so that he would have the money to pay? I mean, this was a real entrepreneurial music business that he was operating, and to some extent, he was grateful when he got the court commissions to write the operas or whatever, because at least a lot of that work was kind of, he wasn't having to generate all of that himself. So to some extent, there's some truth in the idea that Mozart really is exemplary of a kind of moment in the shift in the economic and social status, because he also, in that time, we again and again we hear him talking about how he's hanging out with some of the major aristocracy in Vienna, and he says they treat me like an equal. They show me respect and things. So you do start to have here a composer who represents, as it were, the model of the free artist, although we should always remember that the free artist is always tied by whatever the economic constraints of, whether it's free market capitalism or feudal patronage or whatever, and any one of those positions still requires compromises and so on. I mean, paradoxically, Beethoven, the reason why Beethoven could be as sort of kind of obstreperous and everything that he was, and why his music came to represent some kind of challenge to the status quo and things, was because actually he was very canny in getting himself old-fashioned patrons to support him. He operated in some ways more effectively than Mozart. Kind of went gung-ho for the market, and he, promoting himself as a freelancer in publications. Beethoven was, as I said, was in some ways a bit cannier. He went, he found out the kinds of patrons who would support him, and you already quoted whoever it was who said, let Beethoven be Beethoven. There was a group of highly cultivated aristocrats who did recognize Beethoven. Wagner did much the same, of course. Wagner relied on patrons to enable him to be free, and obviously his most famous patron was King Ludwig of Bavaria. But again, he was actually co-opting an old sort of economic model to some extent in the way he set about creating what he wanted.
Simon, what are your comments on this matter, if any?
Sorry?
I would say, sorry, you're talking to me, are you, Dan?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so, well, I think, no, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I mean, I think that it's important to say that, well, at least in my view, Mozart himself is not a particularly kind of political or politically charged, in the way we would understand it now, kind of 21st century context, composer. I mean, I think somebody like Peter Sellers, of course, believes that Mozart's a revolutionary and embodies revolution from every fibre of his being. But I think in order to have that kind of view, one needs to see that moment that Nick is talking about and interpret, perhaps over-interpret it. Is absolutely right that what Nick is saying, he wants to get out of the Archbishop's clutches and has every intention of doing that. But I think the reason, above all, that he's doing that is pure and simple kind of pragmatism. You know, he wants to carve out an existence for himself, a better existence than he's had, as either Nick or Martin was saying earlier. You know, he has he's had inculcated from a very early age this sense of his importance and his greatness, etc. So, but paradoxically, that means that not maybe paradoxically, but that actually means that what he aspires to is a big court appointment. So it's not as if he is trying to throw the whole system out in some kind of particularly kind of revolutionary sense. I mean, the trip that we were mentioning earlier to Paris, when he'd gone to Munich and Mannheim first and looked for appointments there, he's very disappointed, can't get anything in Munich. He gets to Mannheim, he's even more disappointed, can't get anything in Mannheim because he's created, he's got a good circle of friends there, etc. It would work well for him to be there. So then he heads to Paris because he's looking above all for an appointment there as well. And of course, Vienna, where he has to make up his career 1781 onwards is up initially, and then he goes through a better period because he's earning a lot of money through the piano concerto concerts, etc. But then he's delighted to get an appointment from the Emperor, from Emperor Joseph II, right at the end of 1787 as a kind of chamber composer, playing with the Emperor and composing things as well. So I think, and then of course the French Revolution happens in 1789. We don't get anything from Mozart in terms of any reactions to that. As I say, I think in order to think of one as Mozart as a kind of political kind of revolutionary, one has to interpret quite hard and perhaps over-interpret some of the key moments in his life. If I can just put a word in for Amadeus in that context, since Martin was mentioning it earlier. I mean, I don't see Amadeus as exclusively a kind of 19th century kind of account of Mozart. I think actually what's so I wrote an article about this about Amadeus in the Musical Times a number of years ago, 2009, I think, to coincide with our anniversary. But what struck me when I was thinking that was actually it's a kind of a great summary of so much of Mozart reception. I mean, you've got Salieri telling the story of Mozart from within the 19th century. Of course, Salieri's deathbed is not his deathbed, but when he's in the sanatorium, is the kind of mid 1820s. And he's telling the story of Mozart, who we see in action in so many respects, and in so many, I think, interesting respects that are, while fictional in the specific sense, in the broader sense, interpretationally seem intuitively right. For example, I mean, Nick was talking about a moment earlier that works successfully. It's another nice time. He's playing a march that Salieri has written for him, and he improvises on it, and the improvisation takes him to Non più andrai from Figaro's aria from the end of Act 1 of Figaro. And that sense of playing with somebody else's music, kind of what we call topics, kind of intermixing from one composer to another, one genre to another, kind of taking inspiration from somebody else's music there's something everything about that is absolutely right in terms of the give and take of music and musicians in the context of variations is another example, and writing endless variations on operatic themes of other composers. That give and take, I think, is absolutely right. And then my other favourite scene from one of my other favourite scenes from Amadeus is the Requiem dictation scene, which is again utterly fictitious. Salieri came nowhere near the Requiem. Least of all, tried to claim it as his own after Mozart's death. Of course, Salieri is a kind of stand-in for Süssmayr, at least, kind of from that perspective. But there, I mean, in that dictation scene, you get Mozart building up the piece. In kind of units, the Computatis from the Dies Irae of the Requiem. You get to see how the whole instruments and voices interact in the context of a very small amount of the score, and you then sense of Mozart working kind of compositionally. Again, it's a fictional reconstruction, but I think it works in various ways. So that's the 18th century angle from Amadeus. The 19th century is provided by Salieri, as it were, and then of course he's a kind of in a way a kind of 1980s sort of brat, really, kind of me mentality, me first kind of mentality, which again, no doubt is not especially true to life, although it's quite clear that Mozart did and absolutely needed to prioritize his own interests over others, and was prickly. One of the singers from A Marriage of Figaro, called Michael Kelly, writing his reminiscences, says that he was as fiery as gunpowder, or some such thing, explosive as gunpowder. So he clearly was knew how important and good he was, and he was very sensitive about what other people said and thought of his own music. So as I say, I think with Amadeus we get a kind of synopsis of so much that's important about Mozart's reception in the years since his death.
If I can add something about the movie, I definitely agree with this amazing details that are nearly historically accurate about the creation of the music. But what also fascinates me is how the goal or purpose of music is also seen from this romantic point of view, because at many points throughout the movie, both Salieri and Mozart talk about writing music for posterity and sort of future generations looking at these great, sort of trying to write these great masterpieces, which is, of course, again, an idea that appeared or became really prominent, especially in the 19th century. And I think a great example of this is actually in that scene with the Archbishop, where actually Salieri for the first time hears Mozart's music, and it's I can't remember what piece it is exactly, but it's a serenade,
13 wind instruments.
So it's just a wind serenade, which is again one of these occasional pieces that composers would write for a sort of as a background music for a party, and then Salieri hears it and he says, "Oh, that oboe phrase was filled with eternal longing," and that's really funny because, of course, that's the characterization that then romantic critic E.T.A. Hoffmann used for when he was interpreting Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And so again, it's just this example of how these critical terms appeared in the 19th century and were used for 19th century music, such as Beethoven's symphonies, are here applied to this sort of functional music of the 18th century.
Yes, I mean, I would agree that Salieri is certainly a kind of 19th century construct in the context of that film, early 19th century, right, about Hoffmann, etc. I don't think you ever get Mozart in the film, which I know far better than the play, but I don't think in the film you get Mozart ever saying that he's writing for posterity. Not as far as I can remember, anyway. So I would still like to suggest perhaps that he, as it were, exists in a kind of late 18th century context more than the 19th, in certain respects. Although I entirely take what you're saying on board. I mean, it's interesting that they use the so-called Grand Partita and the Wind Serenade Köchel 361 in context of that scene, because that is quite an extraordinary piece. You're right in some ways wind serenades are occasional pieces, and Mozart wrote a couple seemingly for the harmony group, the group of wind instruments that Emperor Joseph II had formed in early 1782. At the same time, this is a huge work, a massive work, which it's a mystery in Mozart scholarship. One of the enduring mysteries is when exactly it was composed. We know it was composed sometime between 1781 and 1784, when there's the one documented performance of it that clarinetist Schneider put on in a concert in spring of 1784, but we don't really know when exactly it was written between 1781 and 1784. So in a way, yes, Mozart's writing occasional music, but at the same time, there's still a lot we don't know about things like that remains slightly mysterious, because it really is an extraordinary work.
I want to turn to the actual music and the legacy that Mozart had left, but before I do, one final biographical point, and it's shown in the film basically, very symbolically. Nick, I think, had talked about a symbolic act earlier, that, he dies and he's wrapped up in cloth and dumped, with a dozen other paupers in a grave. And just looking it up, apparently that was totally made up, that he actually was buried in a commoner's grave, but singularly. But nonetheless, it seems that the symbolism of the great shunted, neglected artist by the powers that be is wrapped up in that scene. And I'm also looking, it says that there have been over 100 different positive explanations for his death. I'm wondering, do we actually know, was his grave ever found? Has anyone ever dug up from where he was supposedly buried, found the DNA evidence, and do we know if he died of streptococcal pneumonia or this or that? Let me start with Nick. You look ready to go.
No, the answer is no, we don't. We know approximately where his grave was, and there is there's a bit of 19th century sort of grave marker, which might mislead you to think that that's where his body is. But no, there's no way that I know of doing anything forensic on.
Okay.
I think the best way of summarizing it, is his skull was found twice, wasn't it? They found two Mozart skulls. So by regular kind of deduction there, we can establish that there's something going wrong there. But yeah, Nick's absolutely right. And there's endless debate about what caused his death. It almost certainly would be either something connected to a heart infection or something connected to his kidneys. It's one or the other based on symptoms. I don't find that discussion terribly interesting or absorbing, although the rest of it's been done, and I actually could be very interesting, because taking a kind of 18th century perspective on medicine and trying to then interpret what is said and what is discussed in death certificates or whatever it may be may actually be an interesting thing. But I think actually the senior that you were mentioning, Dan, relative to Amadeus, I think it's a fantastic scene, even if factually again I'm incorrect, because you have his whole hearse being taken precisely the moment that they wave the main characters, so Constanza, Baron von Swieten, the maid, Salieri, when they Cavalieri as well, his alleged mistress, when they wave goodbye in effect to the hearse as it's making its final journey to the point at which his body is going to be dispersed. That's the precise point in the Lacrimosa of the Requiem, which is the soundtrack that we hear while all of this is happening. That's precisely the point at which Mozart's score cuts off, the end of the first phrase reaching a climactic kind of crescendo point. Precisely that point. And then we follow Mozart, as it were, and his burial, and we follow it in the completion that was carried out, of course, not by Mozart, but by somebody else. So we're moving from Mozart alive, or having just died, as it were, into Mozart's kind of posthumous reception in the broadest sense, which, of course, and Soesmayer's completion of the Requiem has to fit in that category too. So, whether that's intentional or not is perhaps beside the point, but it's a very nice way of actually of making that transition between Mozart as Mozart alive, and Mozart as an object of posthumous scrutiny and interest. So, and then you've got the wonderful scene where you see a powerful scene, of a body there lying there with the flower cast iron, whatever that substance is that's used to help the body degrade or whatever it is. It's a wonderfully powerful scene as the final Amen from the Lacrimosa, Inso's Bias Completion, rings out. So it's incredibly powerful. As I say, it's clever in that it relates to how we understand Mozart, as well as Mozart, what Mozart actually was, and as far as we're able to determine that.
Martin, do you have a comment?
Just that, we don't know what exactly he died of. I think it's called rheumatic fever, which I guess most diseases then were called rheumatic fever, and so it's up to, there have been a lot of interpretations. And then also, an interesting thing about the movie, again, is that it sort of makes, it is very poignant, the fact that he's buried in a pauper's grave, even though that was a policy in Vienna at that time, that was in effect for a few years before they canceled it. So in fact, most members of the middle class were just put into communal graves at that time. It wasn't just that Mozart was at a time when he was really poor or he unappreciated. It's just how it was a policy for a few years.
It was a policy of Joseph II, and it was exactly the sort of thing that made Joseph II so unpopular. He had very good reasons for it, and justified reasons for it, but of course that was not going to go down well. Although it's interesting that when you go and visit the Habsburg mausoleum, the crypt in Vienna, actually Joseph himself, his mother has this amazing Baroque monument and tomb. And Joseph, there's just a simple lead coffin sitting on, it's rather moving actually, as a sort of symbol of Joseph's sort of both his sort of beliefs and views, but also the fact that actually his reign ended tragically. I mean, it all came apart, and you're just left with this figure in this dead coffin. But that's getting off the point.
Well, I want to sort of wrap things up here, and I'm going to ask you all for a handful of 2 or 3 pieces that you would recommend for beginners to get entree into Mozart's corpus. But before I do that, it was interesting, just to go back to the Beethoven thing. I was Googling Mozart's influence on classical music and just typing in Mozart influenced classical music, and it actually came up with an article about Beethoven, that since Beethoven came later and died 30-some years after, that before Mozart and Beethoven, in like 1780, just as Mozart was getting started, the percentage of musical operas and published musical works, I guess, by dead composers was something like 11 or 12%, and then a century later, in the late 19th century, after Mozart and Beethoven, and I think the piece called it the Beethoven effect, but it might just as well be called the Mozart effect, it was something like the percentage of produced operas and works by dead composers was something approaching 90%, something 87, 88%, and they didn't have statistics for the 20th or 21st centuries, but that it's even higher now. Do you think that Mozart, especially since he came earlier, and you could argue Beethoven too, that they have become so mythic, so protean, these figures that from which all springs, that's one of the things that has sort of kept classical music from growing? I was just listening to Bela Bartok the other day, and he's quite a contrapuntal approach to music. And you see this in jazz, too, when people talk about John Coltrane or Charlie Bird Parker, that there's this need to mythologize that sometimes has a stifling effect on those who come later. Let me start with you, Nick. Do you think that Mozart...
Well, yes, I mean, that's acknowledged very often, because, I mean, part of the whole 19th century thing was this monumentalizing tendency, and, you start to get the building up of the canon of great works, and, as you say, concert repertoires increasingly become full of
yeah. And you see that, of course, with Shakespeare. Shakespeare's all over, whereas people like O'Neill or Ibsen or modern playwrights who may have some talent, will not get as produced, and we'll get the 1200th version of Twelfth Night,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, And that becomes, I mean, you know, to some extent, you know, Beethoven, even more than Mozart, actually, Beethoven becomes the figure against whom other composers have to measure themselves, and are often, therefore, you know, feel quite stifled by them. That classically, Brahms.
But isn't it part of the legend that Beethoven was himself challenging himself with Mozart? So what was the difference in that?
I think, you know, he recognized it. You know, absolutely recognized. You know how important Mozart and Haydn, who actually he studied with briefly, were, and that to some extent, you know, there are a lot of his works you could say are being written in some kind of dialogue with the key works by Haydn and maybe even more by Mozart. Yes,
because Harold Bloom. Hold on 1 second. Harold Bloom, the literary critic, speaks of Shakespeare and calls the term the anxiety of influence, and that seems to have been something that's carried over. Simon, go ahead.
Absolutely, yes, and then talks about all the different strategies that you know, writers or composers or whatever come up with, and there's someone's done a musical, you know, taken Bloom's analysis.
Many people. Bloom is off the bloom now, I think, but he was certainly being talked about a lot in the 90s and so on. I mean, I think actually, if you think about Mozart and Beethoven, and Beethoven's kind of response to Mozart, the one very easy place to start, actually, which is that Beethoven wrote cadenzas or a cadenza rather, to the first movement of cadenza of Mozart's D minor piano concerto, K.K. 466. There was no concerto left in Mozart's hand, and performers still today will very often perform the Beethoven version. But actually, if you look at what Beethoven does, and actually look at examples of cadenzas that Mozart writes that are extant that we have, you can see that there's a world of difference in terms of how they work, and that that has been passed. Actually, in terms of a kind of an anxiety of influence, I think a better way of talking about it is just that as we were sort of saying earlier, they come from different cultures and consequently respond differently. And I think Nick's right that the Beethoven is imposing as an influence to many in the 19th century, perhaps because Mozart is slightly less present, as it was. Beethoven died in 1827, Mozart in 1791. Because Beethoven is more present and Mozart less present, I think actually the influence can work to some extent more organically, perhaps even in certain senses more positively. You know, you think of somebody like Tchaikovsky. If there's one composer who seems a world away from Mozart in the 19th century, it would probably be Tchaikovsky. And yet Tchaikovsky is probably the biggest, in terms of among composers, he's probably the biggest fan of Mozart of all. You know, who's an enormous admirer of Mozart's music. And, you know, as I say, that doesn't play into kind of any kind of stylistic sense about how Tchaikovsky is working relative to Mozart. Clearly, they're apples and orange, chalk and cheese, what metaphor you want to use. But they're miles apart. But yet the influence in a general sense is there. I mean, Wagner, obviously, as everybody knows, Wagner is a huge fan of Beethoven, sees himself as a successor to Beethoven, sort of breaking out beyond the Ninth Symphony, which has involved choirs and texts, and so kind of the symphony as program music equals the music drama, etc. So he sees himself as the great successor to Beethoven. You know, in many respects, he's very positive also about Mozart. I think he said at one stage he considers himself the last of the Mozartians in Wagner's. And that may have something to do with the way in which character portrayals work. I mean, you think of Wagner, you think of the kind of psychology of how characters interact and how characters behave and what they actually are. And you know, there's very much equivalent in terms of kind of Mozart's output, in terms of sophistication of characters and their mentalities, their motivations, and how Mozart represents that as well. So I think that that the influence that Mozart has on 19th century composers, as I say, can be more positive in a general sense than the influence of Beethoven, precisely because there isn't quite that proximity with Mozart that there is with Beethoven.
Martin, what are your comments about sort of the hyperbolizing of Mozart and someone like Beethoven and its influence possibly negatively on those who came later?
Oh, I definitely agree. After Beethoven, there's this. I love the term anxiety of influence because all composers afterwards need to be as good as Beethoven, yet also achieve over Beethoven and write something that's new and innovative and do something different, which I think makes it a lot harder. And what I find really interesting about Mozart and Beethoven is that, again, they sort of stand or live in a period in transition where Mozart, or if you look at Beethoven, he is already writing, sketching out works and writing very intensely to write pieces that he self-consciously is thinking as being these masterpieces for posterity. Mozart, I don't think is there yet, with a few exceptions, of course, such as maybe his late symphonies that he sort of writes without any specific commission that we know of. But otherwise, he's writing works for specific commissions, specific social occasions, and I think the thing is that then he ends up writing pieces that are different from what the standard is, that sort of stand out from what his contemporaries are writing, and they themselves then create this new standard for everything has to be written, needs to be a masterpiece. So in a way, both Mozart and Beethoven, in that sense, make it a lot harder for later generations of composers to compose, because they are in this constant competition of this legacy of these great masters that they need to.
Go
Sorry, can I just come in just very quickly, a quick addendum that Martin, I think Martin will know, it's just the way that he put it. I just wanted to clarify this. I mean, certainly we don't know for sure why he wrote the last three symphonies, but what we do know is that he wrote them for a purpose, and it wasn't some kind of, sort of romantic envisaging of kind of works that would in any sense survive him. We know there are plenty of concerts he could have written for, he was thinking about a trip to England, that kind of thing. So there are all kinds of reasons why he wrote the symphonies. I don't disagree with your general point, but I think there is still this image that a number of people have, that the last three symphonies were written kind of, as a posthumous kind of with a posthumous sentiment in mind, which I think is just simply not right. Mozart never wrote anything for that reason.
Well,
yes, unlike Beethoven, then later.
Well, I want to ask for final comments across the board, and in doing so, also ask if you could maybe name one or two pieces you think are the greatest Mozart pieces, and for those who are coming new to him, maybe a neglected piece that someone should listen to because it hasn't gotten the due it should have. And as I mentioned, I listened to Bela Bartok, and with composers oftentimes, and I also was listening to some Handel as well, and with them you get an emotional kind of tenor. If I'm feeling complex and gloomy, there's Beethoven. There's Bartok. If I'm feeling angry, I guess I'll listen more to him. With Mozart, it's always sort of like, if I want to feel good, I listen to Mozart. So let me ask you, Nick, can you give your idea of what is the greatest piece or two, and a neglected piece in your final comments?
Well, I'm not very good at careful numbers or, which piano concerto is number, whatever. I mean, for me, the piano concertos are the absolutely exemplary works. All the things really that people have said already, there's astonishing sort of fluidity of emotional sort of journey that Mozart takes you on in these works, and there's a sort of profligacy in the sort of ideas and the way that he'll just switch from one thing to the next and introduce something else, and that they just keep you sort of completely alive. And then there are these moments of just the most surprising moments of sublime, beautiful beauty, where suddenly the whole thing will stop and there'll be this sort of suspended moment of beauty. And then you've always just got this sense of Mozart's presence in the piano part. Of course, we can't have him, but you get the sense of him, in terms of sort of imagining him sitting there at the piano playing for those works, and in particular, it's the bunch of Viennese works, the group that some referred to already that you wrote in the first part of the 1780s, which are just for me miraculous.
Martin, what works would you say are the one or two most essential or greatest, and is there a work that you would say, you know?
Well, I'm going to ask someone to identify a piano, because I say I'm hopeless at...
Oh, sorry, okay, so, I mean, I would say, yeah, it's very difficult. I've worked on them so much over so many years, and revisited them in so many different contexts as well. I mean, I think that, I mean, my theory is that the great C minor piano concerto Opus 491 is in some senses very, very difficult to beat. I think so. I mean, it's the final. It works biographically. It's the final one, or yes, it is the final one of the sequence from kind of 1782 to spring of 1786. So it's the last one he writes, the great C major 503 after that. But yet it's climactic aesthetically and stylistically too. You get this raw, incredible rawness of exchange between the piano and the orchestra. We've got the intricacies of dialogue, of given the recapitulation in the first movement is wonderful. Then you have a slow movement that's just superb, with wind instruments very much on an even keel with the piano. Then you have these austere and gritty but wonderful variations at the end, which ends in the minor mode as well, which many of Mozart's minor mode instrumental music doesn't do. So I think the C minor piano concerto is very difficult to beat in that respect, and I would agree. I think actually, if push comes to shove, I would take the piano concertos as a corpus, as a genre, if I could only have one of them, as it were. I mean, I suppose I would say, I mean, in terms of neglected works, I mean, I'm quite lucky, obviously, in that having just done a biography of musically oriented biography of Mozart and Vienna, I've listened to everything from beginning to end, 1781 to 91. And I mean, I suppose what I was really struck, it was just the incredible quality of so much music that we don't listen to very much. For example, any of the kind of concert arias that he wrote, insert arias he wrote in for other people's operas, from piano years. I mean, they're all absolutely superb, and that quality is remarkable. Even when ostensibly scholars think that he slipped a bit. Clemenza di Tito is a case in point, but there are fantastic ensembles and arias and instrumental writing, in Tito, which is wonderful. And I suppose it'd be very difficult if you had to think of kind of what one work. If somebody who doesn't know Mozart at all, what would they listen to? What would I give them? I suppose I'd give them a different work. The old Bernstein story about when he's asked, which is his favourite Mozart piano concerto, he replies, apocryphally or not, probably not, but he said whichever one I'm listening to at the moment. And in a way, that sentiment would apply to me relative to kind of what plays into Mozart and particular works. I would think differently at different times about which one I'd most like to keep. But something like the Kegelstadt trio, piano trio, which is for piano, viola, and clarinet. From 1786 is just this wonderful kind of vignette. It captures a lot of things we've talked about, sort of occasional music, kind of wonderful exchange between piano and the other instruments. Pristine, it's gorgeous, and it gives you a real sense of beauty, really. That Mozart is so eminently capable of. And on the theme of beauty, let's say something like the first act of Così fan tutte, which is almost parallel in terms of having just so many gorgeous ensembles one after another. It's just you just don't know how he can do it, really, because it's just one wonder after another, and the arias too. But I think it always strikes me with Così first act. It's the ensembles that are so remarkable. So I mean, neglected. It's a bit difficult when we talk about with Mozart, because neglect is a relative thing, and Mozart doesn't suffer that in the way that some other composers certainly do. But as I say, I'd give a shout out for something like the concert arias, which are so good and which are never talked about as being great works, but they certainly are.
Martin, you'll have the final word then. What would you state to someone coming to Mozart as for his greatest works, and if any neglected?
So I mean, I have to say the operas, obviously, and personally, I mean, I've written so much about the magic flute, and so that just to me seems like an encyclopedia of all these different styles and genres, and definitely shows Mozart as this sponge who is absorbing and then regurgitating all these ideas of the late 18th century, and is extremely rich. Yet at the same time is very accessible, right? Sort of some of the greatest tunes ever are in that opera. So it's this combination of music that's both complex, psychologically complex, interesting on many different levels. Yes, yet it's also engaging to wide-ranging audience even nowadays, and I think that's what makes it just so wonderful. And then on the other hand, I do really like Così fan tutte, because it's on the other hand that's an opera that's just very complicated and really evasive in terms of what exactly it is trying to say, and yet at the same time contains some amazing music, as Simon said. So that's great. And then as far as sort of neglected works, I do think that there's just constantly new angles that we are exploring about Mozart and his how his work relates to his contemporaries, and so I don't know. I think that all of us out is sort of equally in need of being constantly discussed and performed and explored.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for your time, and I will link to your web pages below this video. Anyone can contact you if they have any questions or follow-ups or want to buy any of your works. And thank you all for appearing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.